By now, it's pretty widely understood that we're in a golden age of television. And for those who write about TV, a role which didn't always have the cachet that book or theater critics had, they are also getting their due. In 2016, Emily Nussbaum won the Pulitzer Prize for criticism for her work. She is the television critic for The New Yorker, and her new book is called I Like to Watch, Arguing My Way Through the TV Revolution, and it brings Emily Nussbaum to our studio tonight. So great to meet you.
Thanks for having me.
This book is terrific. Well, you know this already. This book is really, I enjoyed it so much. It's a great read. But I do want to start with this. I'm going to pluck this out and read this excerpt. Like many children of the 70s, I grew up sitting cross-legged in front of a big console in the living room, singing along to the Electric Company while my mom made Kraft macaroni and cheese. I dug Taxi. I loved MASH. In my teens, I memorized Monty Python sketches with my friend Maria. But I also regarded TV the way that Americans had been taught to since the 1950s. Television was junk. That was certainly what I was taught as well.
Absolutely.
You know, we grew up calling it the boob tube and the idiot box and all this kind of stuff. So how does someone go from working on their PhD in literature, which I think was you, yes?
Yes.
To being a TV critic?
Well, there's a very simple answer to this question.
Go ahead.
The answer is Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and a specific episode, The Pack, in 1997, when I was in graduate school. I was busy working on my doctorate, working toward a doctorate on Victorian literature, and I sat down to relax. I watched this one episode, which even Buffy fans do not tend to consider a real breakthrough or great episode, and I had what amounted to a conversion experience. I loved the show. I literally called a friend during the commercial, and for the first time in my life, I became a fan. And I'm not a fan in my regular job, but becoming a fan is actually what I feel transformed me into a critic. And not only do I love the show, but I became kind of a crazed super fan of it and was online talking anonymously about it and arguing with people and talking people into watching it. And around the same time that Buffy came out, The Sopranos came out. And I was a huge fan of The Sopranos as well.
Let me jump in there, because The Sopranos was a television phenomenon.
Yes.
And it was sort of critically and artistically acclaimed as well. Buffy was more along the lines of a guilty pleasure, wasn't it?
That's exactly what began to rankle me in this slightly psycho way. I loved both shows. This wasn't a question of saying, no, Buffy is better than The Sopranos or anything like that. But they were on two different tracks critically. The Sopranos was acclaimed as a show that was great, not because it was a great television show, but because it transcended television. It was better than what television was. It was more like a book, it was more like a movie. And Buffy got positive response, but it was treated as a girly show, as a genre show, and very much as TV, and it really was TV. And what the book is about in a lot of ways is about the aftermath of my reaction to those two shows, which is this desire to break open the notion that only shows that transcend TV or are not TV can be praised.
Okay, we'll talk about some of those, but let's go back first. Why did TV have such a bad rap before that?
I mean, I think there were a lot of different reasons. I mean, any new medium tends to get a response from the public that is a little bit about the crasser things about it. I mean, this is true of a lot of different mediums like comic books and things like that. And also, television initially was just a gadget. It was a technology. I mean, there's no way to divide the question of how people respond to TV from how it's distributed. And initially it was live, it was a very commercial art form, and it became a cheap mass medium. And over the decades, it was perceived in a lot of ways less as an artistic medium than as something like an addiction. Like bad for you, like chain smoking or junk food or something like that. I mean, I think there were a lot of good reasons that people looked down on TV. It was essentially seen as something that was just there to sell products. But part of what I'm interested in is talking about the way that TV developed and has specific qualities of its own that make it different than other mediums, including being episodic, being collaborative, all of these kinds of things. But anyway, one of the things it never really shed, though, was that bad reputation, the status anxiety that kind of hovered over it, even when there were good TV shows.
Well, let me pick up on one of those. I know when I was a kid, the morning after All in the Family aired, everybody was talking about it. I don't know that that happens so much anymore because we just consume content so differently now, but back then you had one shot to watch these shows and you watched them and everybody talked about it the next day. All in the Family was not bad television. All in the Family was phenomenal.
Yeah, it was great.
And just, again, for those who are not of the age who would remember it, it's the sort of lovable bigot, Archie Bunker, his dingbat wife, and his socialist son-in-law and their daughter. And I guess I want to know, when Norman Lear, the creator, realized that people loved this show and they loved Archie Bunker in spite of his racism and narrow-minded view of the world, how problematic was that for him?
Norman Lear is an enormous hero to me. And part of the reason is because when he began to create those shows in the 70s, he broke through a lot of the rules of what TV was capable of doing. And some of those things were actually about talking about the real world and talking about politics in the real world. But it seems to me from everything I've read and everything he's talked about, that he had a sincere desire to create Archie Bunker as an educational show for people, that you had lovable feelings about him as a bigot and as somebody that you cared about, but that you rejected his ideas. But the truth is that when the show came out, it created a divided audience. There was a whole part of the audience that watched Archie as an avatar for them, as a representative of their own beliefs.
It's Trump world.
Well, when the show came out, it was not considered, it was a huge hit, but it was very divisive. There were a lot of critics who saw it as an incredibly harmful show, specifically because it was glamorizing bigotry or making bigotry cuddly, treating both sides as completely legitimate. And so I think that pattern of creating a show that is watched differently by different audiences is key to understanding TV. And in a lot of ways, I feel like Archie Bunker is a precursor to the anti-heroes like Tony Soprano, who came later.
Bingo, that's where I want to go now. We're going to go back 20 years, 1999, the premiere of The Sopranos on HBO. And here's what you write about that. Filmed on location with a budget that helped it look almost good enough to play on the big screen, The Sopranos emphasized imagery over action, characters over plot, letting threads dangle and themes build. It felt like a book. It looked like a movie. Its hero was someone viewers took seriously, a towering symbolic figure, Tony Soprano, the first of the great middle-aged white male anti-heroes who would dominate TV for nearly a decade. Why do you think audiences fell for the anti-hero like Tony Soprano, like Walter White from Breaking Bad, like Don Draper from Mad Men? How come?
Well, honestly, in the case of The Sopranos is just a brilliant show. I mean, it is a kind of a masterpiece. Why did they fall for him? Part of it is because of James Gandolfini's towering performance. I mean, the show is excellent, but his performance is also transformative, tremendously charismatic, very attractive. And that's what's complicated about characters and stories like that.
But that's so weird that we would fall for it. He is a murderous thug who's not physically appealing either. He's massively...
I don't know, James Gandolfini's not...
Yeah, well, put it this way, not classic movie star good looks, right? He's no Clark Gable.
People had big crushes on James Gandolfini in that role, and I don't think that's unusual. I think that the idea of the sexy criminal or mobster is not that new. It was somewhat new for TV, though, because TV historically had been thought to be a place where you literally couldn't have a character who was repulsive or off-putting. There had been experiments with anti-heroes or negative characters earlier. I mean, as I said, Archie Bunker was kind of a precursor to anti-heroes, but there was a show, I remember, Buffalo Bill, with Dabney Coleman, and I remember people talking about, will TV audiences tolerate an unpleasant main character? And because the show was canceled, the answer was apparently no. But the last 20 years have marked a series of increasingly unpleasant main characters in the aftermath of Tony Soprano. But anyway, I think that the reason that people found that character appealing was the character is in many ways designed to create both attraction and repulsion, and that's what's powerful about the show. But one of the things that marks that show as a really powerful TV masterpiece is that the creator of the show, I think, was repulsed by the fan base's attraction to his character. So halfway through the show, he started turning against them and essentially punching them in the face with the message that, in fact, this guy was a sociopath and making it harder to watch the show. And I think that's one of the things that's very powerful and unusual about that show.
There's a line in that show where, if you're a parent, This guy is a mob boss. He can have anybody he wants killed at a moment's notice. He is rich. He's got it all. And he says, at what point did we come to understand that we have no more control over our 16-year-old daughter? Every parent gets that. That might be one of the reasons why he's so lovable in a way, too.
I do think that it's, it's a powerful, multi-layered metaphor. I mean, a lot of really good art operates at multiple levels. It's a show that's about capitalism. It's a show that's about men of his particular generation, notions about masculinity. I mean, it's what makes it last as a series.
Now, what about Game of Thrones? How did that change the notion of what we consider to be an historic, groundbreaking, blockbuster, must-see television?
I've got to be frank. I'm not that interested in Game of Thrones. This
You do talk about it.
I talk about it.
Tiny little bit.
Yeah, I've reviewed Game of Thrones. I didn't include any of those reviews in this book. I mean, part of the thing about what I'm writing about is trying to expand the conversation of what kinds of shows are talked about and taken seriously, and about that ladder of hierarchy in which this certain kind of dramatic anti-hero show is treated as the main thing that's worthy of conversation is part of what's bothered me all along. And so I'm trying to kind of explode that. So the truth is, even though I think Game of Thrones was an interesting and beautifully filmed show, and definitely a popular show, and a meaningful show in terms of talking about politics, because it ended up, like Survivor, operating as kind of a second language that people used, it's not the show that I'm the most interested in it.
You don't think it changed television history?
I mean, one of the tricky things about talking about TV, and you asked earlier, why was TV not taken seriously? One of the reasons is that it's often been hard to divide the question of what's an important show, what's a good show, what's a popular show, and what shows make money. Because ratings and quality have so frequently, for completely legitimate reasons, been wound up in the history of TV that I think for a long time, even people writing criticism of TV only could really write about shows as important if they were also popular. And a lot of the shows that I liked the best, like Crazy Ex-Girlfriend was a show I loved. I think it was the lowest rated show. But Crazy Ex-Girlfriend to me is a more important show in certain artistic ways than Game of Thrones. I mean, it's not that I have nothing to say about Game of Thrones.
No, I get it, but how can Crazy Ex-Girlfriend?
Yeah.
I never heard of it. How can it be an important show if 95% of the people have never heard of it?
Well, because beautiful and powerful art is always important. I mean, I often say this thing where I say, if I knew anything about economics and what becomes popular, I would not have become an arts critic. Like, my expertise is really in what's interesting and original and powerful in TV, and not specifically what does well in the ratings. My interest in the ratings extends to, will my show be able to stay on the air? Like, the TV...
No, but you got to have impact, too. You don't have impact if you're not around.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm always fascinated by the fact that, like, 30 Rock is another show that I loved and was very interested in. It survived because NBC was failing, and it was a failing network that had a fantastic show. It probably would have canceled that show if it had anything to replace it because it got such low ratings. Luckily for fans of the show, it got to stick around. So if I told you the shows that I find the most important shows, some of them would be very popular shows, but a lot of them would probably be far outside that and off the radar.
Since you brought up 30 Rock, that's one of the few shows that has a female lead character. And I wonder what's your view of the fact that television seems to have precious few programs where it's a female lead character, it's a gay lead character, it's a person of color who's a lead character. They don't seem to do much of that.
Actually, I'm sorry.
You're going to disagree with me?
Because maybe the last 5 years.
Okay.
And this is to me so exciting. And this is not to me just about representation and diversity, although those things are important. It's about more stories, more interesting stories, more varied stories. And the last 5 years have marked a real explosion in terms of representation. Because it's interesting, when some of the shows that first had, you said, talking about 30 Rock having a female main character, at this point, to me in the last few years, almost all of the most interesting and powerful shows have been from the categories that you're talking about. Not universally, but if I named all of the female-centered comedic shows of the last few years that I found interesting, there's a huge set of them. And the great thing about them is that they no longer have to be the female show on the air or the black show. So that when, for instance, Girls, Scandal, 30 Rock, when they came out, they were exceptions and people had to talk about them as iconoclastic. That's no longer true. I literally could just list off to you, like, Claws, Glow, Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, Jane the Virgin, Broad City.
So you know what this reflects?
Lady Dynamite.
This reflects the fact that I've not seen any of these shows. My TV
Enlightened.
habits are 10, 15 years out of date.
Like Game of Thrones was a very interesting show. Enlightened was a far more interesting show. Another HBO show, a really powerful show, canceled after 2 seasons. But luckily, because the technology has changed, people can revisit it. So I actually, I don't think it's unusual for there to be a female main character or for there to be people from marginalized categories in terms of TV storytelling who are now showrunners. I think there's been big breakthroughs with that. And I have 3 profiles in this book of Genji Kohan, who made Orange is the New Black, which is another show like that. Ryan Murphy, who has made it his mission to put queer characters at the center of shows, and Kenya Barris, who's Blackish, was a big breakthrough on ABC and who's now at Netflix. And I think that this really marks not only an expansion of the kind of people who get to make TV, but the kind of experimentation that can take place, because each of those people doesn't have to be like a role model who represents and creates a character everybody can identify with. When you have niche characters, you get a much more interesting conversation.
I will never forget, was it 25, 30 years ago when Jerry Lewis said, no women are funny, and that's why they don't have their own either late night comedy shows or sitcoms or whatever. That was obviously an incredibly stupid thing to say. And we are in a time right now where female leading funny women are all over the place. What do you make of this trend?
Well, you know, I think Sarah Silverman said this thing about Jerry Lewis saying that, where she was like, there's no way to respond to it because it's just a pathetic statement. Like, my interest in women on TV, gay people on TV, people of color on TV is just on them being people on TV and like there being a wider range of voices. So I don't see it as a trend. I mean, it genuinely is this thing where
I knew as soon as I said trend, you were going to
leap on that. I don't want to be argumentative about it, but it's hard for me to even think about it that way. And to me, the really refreshing thing is it does seem to me like there was a turning point a couple of years ago. I don't know if you remember all of the huge debates about Girls, Lena Dunham's show, but
never seen it.
You know, it was one of those things where, and that was a show that probably didn't get huge ratings, but dominated the media. And I think part of it was because the show itself triggered this enormous anxiety about female representation and whether shows were good for women, bad for women, what they meant. Since then, you know, a lot of the most heroic figures to me on TV, not heroic in terms of morality, but like artistically breakthrough figures, have been women. And this, you know, some of them have been men, but I don't like to separate things out like that. What?
One of them's from here.
Which person?
Samantha Bee.
Yeah, Samantha Bee's fantastic.
Yeah.
That show is, see, that's an exception. When I talk about there having been an enormous expansion of the kind of stories that get told and the kind of interesting people who get to make them and the ways women get to be funny, which range from, you know, Blue to sort of sensitive dramedies to all sorts of different things. Samantha Bee is on late night, and hosts on late night. Like, it's so many white men named Jimmy. Like, it's just, it's been perpetually a very narrow range of people. So her show, which is a great show, is inevitably marked as a female show. And I think it's a terrific show. I think she's really smart and funny and angry and great.
You know what, I gotta say, I never understood those comments to begin with. I grew up with Joan Rivers. I grew up with Toady Fields. I grew up with Phyllis Diller. These were funny women. So this notion that, you know, it's news that women are funny just didn't seem news to me.
You know, I'm fascinated by Joan Rivers. She's a very important and iconic figure to me. I have an essay in the book that's about Joan Rivers, and it's an essay about both how she was, as you say, an enormous trailblazer, the most popular female comedian of the time, and also really the reason that she was able to be successful was because she herself held and reflected all of the misogyny of the world about women. The reason that she was the one comedian who was able to get onto Johnny Carson's show because Johnny Carson was a massive sexist and didn't think women were funny, wouldn't hire female writers. But Joan Rivers, who was very funny, tremendously hardworking, and a lot of her comedy was about self-loathing, her self-loathing matched his feelings about women. And the two of them were an amazing team where they would trade these jokes back and forth. Part of what the essay is about is me coming to terms as a woman with her as an image, because I remember her as terrifying when I would see her on the Carson show and on her own show. She was
Terrifying?
glamorous and beautiful and funny and powerful, and half of her jokes were about like Liz Taylor being fat.
Right.
You know, she would go on the red carpet, and you know, a lot of her jokes were
Skewer
about
everybody.
her being ugly. She would gag, all of those kinds of things. The message to me that I got was basically, if you ever rise high enough to be in the public eye, this woman will be there to cut you down and tell you that you either look too slutty or too hideous.
So she was not a constructive influence as far as you were concerned.
She was both. I mean, she's a tremendous role model. First of all, she was a massive workaholic and just sort of thrillingly productive all the way through her life. So I think that somebody, you know, I think when you talk about somebody with a tremendous legacy like that, the legacy can just be complicated. I mean, she's neither some sort of negative role model, nor is she just a purely inspiring figure. But the great thing is that in the aftermath of Joan Rivers, long after that, I feel like the doors have crashed open so fully that that ugly feeling that sort of only one woman can be the female comic, and that what she has to do is she has to express nothing but self-loathing in order to be adorable.
No, those days are gone.
Those days are gone.
Thankfully, yeah. Okay, let me get into some. You ask a wonderful question here, and it's a tough question in this Me Too era in which we live, and that is, what should we do with the art of terrible men? What's the answer?
I have an essay in the book that I wrote specifically because when I was on book leave, it was the fall of 2017. I was planning to write several other essays, and the Weinstein piece broke, and it was really like a volcano of shame, terrible stories, a real enormous cultural change. And it was on my mind all the time. And so I ended up writing something that's an attempt to wrestle with that question. But I don't have an answer to it. The essay is partially a personal essay, and it's partially me thinking about the men who've shaped who I am and how I respond to their art, ranging from Woody Allen to Roman Polanski to Bill Cosby to Louis C.K. And part of what I'm talking about is the question not just of what do we do with their art, but what do I do with their art as an arts critic? Like, I'm not a big fan of pushing away art and acting like it doesn't exist because it makes us uncomfortable. But part of what I struggle with in that essay is the question of how do you write about the work of somebody when their real life acts seem to like stain the work itself or be reflected in the work. You know, Woody Allen is an incredibly important figure to me. I mean, the piece starts with me talking about how he was my North Star as a little kid. I watched all his movies, I listened to his albums, and I think it would be dishonest if I didn't act as though that was true. I mean, I call him, I think, the base coat to my comic sensibility. It's absolutely true.
You're two New Yorkers, of course he would be.
Yeah, we have
You're two Jewish New Yorkers, of
yeah,
course he would be.
I was gonna say. It's like, you know, I probably still have like an old Woody Allen imitation. There's no way to detach the people who influenced you from who you are. But I do find it, and Purple Rose of Cairo is one of my favorite movies. I don't
Mia's
have
in
it.
that one, isn't she?
Purple Rose of Cairo, yeah, and she's wonderful in it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a great movie. One of the people I talk about in this is actually Roman Polanski, and one of the things I point out is that Rosemary's Baby is a fantastic, bold, masterpiece feminist movie made by a sex criminal. That's the contradiction that we all have to deal with. Part of what I'm searching for in that piece is a way as an arts critic to write about the work, acknowledge great work, and not have to do this slightly sociopathic thing of acting like the work and the person who created it are just in separate universes and you can just ignore the larger system that surrounds them.
Let's talk about the influence of Netflix. When House of Cards came along, this is back in 2013, rather than have to wait week by week by week, the whole thing just dropped. And binge watching became a whole new thing. How did this change television in your view?
Well, first of all, it sent me into years of distress and mourning because my whole idea about TV as a unique art form had to do with the way that it moves over time, over years, episodically, in a loop with the audience, how different it was from other art forms because the audience responds to TV and then TV responds back to the audience. once Netflix came out and you'd get a whole season at once, some of my basic ideas about TV were no longer true. So I'm still struggling with this. On the other hand, it is very delightful to get an entire season of TV, ignore your entire family, hole yourself up, and then just watch every episode in a row.
What's the longest time you've done that for?
Well, because of my wonderful job, which allows me to watch in, whole series. I mean, sometimes it's not about Netflix. Like a few times I've been writing about shows like, and I've watched several seasons in a week. So at one point my editor asked me to write about The Walking Dead, which I was not caught up on. So I watched 3 seasons of The Walking Dead in a week. It was very unpleasant.
How many episodes per season?
I'm not sure. Walking Dead has a fair amount. It's so changed because it used to be, always 21 episodes. Now it can be 10.
So let's say 16. So you watched
I watched a lot.
to 48 episodes in a row.
I also watched all of Key and Peele in a week, and it was the most amazing week. It was wonderful.
That'd be
That's a
fun.
great show to binge. So how has binge watching changed things? Well, one thing is that nobody knows when to talk about TV anymore.
Right.
I mean, this is actually a problem for people who care about shows because you can't figure out whether you're spoiling things. People are catching up months later. I mean, there's a way in which I can't really say what the answer is, like how has it changed things? It's, I mean, there are some very appealing things about streaming. One of them is that there can be a different amount of episodes, and I think that the old model where it was just 3 networks and they had to produce 21 to 22 episodes a year is very draining for TV creators, and people who can pull it off are miracle makers to me. But I do think that a lot of shows are made to be 8 to 12 episodes. And there's also the possibility of a show that lasts for just 1 season. That's more of that's also a good option. I mean, to me, a more various industry is a better industry, and it provides more options for artistic experimentation, which is what I like.
It is the golden age of television now, isn't it? I think it is. And you seem to like a lot of what's going on now, too.
Although I will note that there are several vicious pans in this book.
Oh, yes.
I don't want to come off like I like everything.
You are from New York. Come on now. I get it. It's funny. I mentioned this title to a bunch of people this morning. Nobody got the reference.
Really?
Yeah, isn't that crazy?
It is interesting.
I Like to Watch is the name of the book. And if you remember, I assume it's Chauncey Gardner.
Yes.
Okay. So there we go. Watch the movie Being There if you don't know what the title refers to. But there's Emily Nussbaum arguing her way through the TV revolution, and we're so glad it has brought you north to Toronto for this interview tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It was
Delighted.
wonderful.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.